Today's podcast is brought to you by the Monkey Method app. This is an app brought to you by Power Monkey, and what we've done with this app is really exciting. We're really proud of it. Something we've been working on for a number of years. It basically allows for skill development plans to be put into place in one easy to follow along format. We have over 1,200 videos in there that are free to access. Even if you don't buy one of the plans, they're always there in the palm of your hand, very easily accessible technique videos. Along with that, we have a bunch of gymnastics and weightlifting plans in there that are all assessment based. So it's not a one size fits all plan. You can go in there, do the assessment, and figure out what category, what level you are based in according to what your starting point looks like. You'll have a tailored program, something that's a little bit more individualized. I'm really proud of it and hope you guys take advantage of it. Hey everyone, welcome to another Power Monkey podcast. On today's episode, Chad and I interview Gary Reinl, who is the author of Iced, the illusionary treatment option. Gary goes into a concept that he's been working on for a number of years now, and it has to do with the RICE protocol, which is rest, ice, compression, elevation, but discussing specifically the ice portion and whether or not ice is a verifiable treatment option for injuries. You know, you slap that ice bag on as soon as you had an injury or a sprained ankle, whatever it might be. And Gary goes into some thoughts on whether or not ice is actually helping and whether or not it actually could be doing more harm than benefit. I think you guys might be interested in listening to this one. It might change the way you approach your next injury, so enjoy it.
All right, Gary Reinl, welcome to the Power Monkey Fitness Podcast. So excited to have you today.
I love being here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. You know, I've been fortunate enough to have a couple pretty long conversations with you here over the last few weeks, and I've learned a tremendous amount. And really, you're here to talk about, you know, your I would say your main passion and your message. And what we really want to share with the Power Monkey community is that we as athletes shouldn't be icing anymore. We're going to get to that, and we're going to, you know, you're going to, of course, talk in detail about that. And really, through those conversations that I had for you, it didn't take the first 5 minutes of the first conversation for you to explain enough to me to where I was completely on board. So we're definitely going to get to that. And I want you guys to hold tight for a little bit, though, because before we do, I'm very interested to hear a little bit about your books and your writings. And, you know, this book that you wrote about icing and not icing, and more specifically, the RICE protocol and kind of speaking against that. You've also written a few other books. And I wonder, because I do a lot of writing myself, so I'm very interested to hear, you know, other people's purpose for writing. What is your purpose for writing in general, Gary? Is it a way to support yourself financially? Is it a way to support other content? Do you love writing? Is it something that, so for me, for example, I feel like I almost have to do it as a release for myself?
Well, it's a great question. I've never been asked that before, but I can tell you, I don't do it for the money, and I don't do it for anyone else, to tell you the truth. I do it because I want to understand something. And when I begin to sort and allow just general knowledge to come, I'm able to figure things out that I want to know. For example, when I started working in this field with professional world-class athletes, I wanted to know the best way to use ice. So that's what I did. I set out to become the number one person in the world on the use of ice. And you might be tempted to say, well, why would you think you could become the number one person in the world? Well, because after about a year and a half of talking to people and reading the literature and textbooks and interviewing hundreds and hundreds of some of the most elite doctors, therapists, and trainers in the country, I realized that there was no protocol. By the way, there's no protocol. Like, you can't go to this place and say, hey, I want to do the RICE protocol, and it be even remotely similar to what someone else of equal credentials would tell you to do. In other words, how cold should you make it? How long should you keep it cold? How often should you make it cold? Should you make bones the same temperature, like if you're a broken bone or a shin splint, should you make that the same temperature as a bruise? Should you do something different in your hands or your feet? Are you different than me? You see all the problems of not understanding the best way to do it. Well, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to do it the best way. So that's why I write, to sit down and say, okay, well, here's what I learned there. Here's what this book says.
Mm-hmm.
Here's what this other expert said to me. And I just interview people. And everything I've ever done, I always took it to go and say, who are the experts? Let me go find out what they're doing and why, and then categorize information. And that causes, in effect, me to write. And that's how I write. I don't sit down and say, oh, I want to write something. It doesn't work that way. It comes through the innate intelligence of the world, and it just comes through me. And right now I'm working on a paper, and out of nowhere, I mean, when I say out of nowhere, I get a call from the guy who's heading the international chair on that topic. And I went, okay, how'd you get my number? He said, well, I have a friend who knows you with your work with ice, and I want to talk to you. And I said, well, that's really cool, but I want to talk to you too. So after I answer your questions, will you answer a couple for me? And you could say to yourself, how could that happen? You stay out of the way. And I honestly, truthfully believe you can put truth serum and the lie detector machine on me. I honestly believe if you stay out of the way, the information will come through you. And that's why I write, because I allow it to come through me, and I'm thrilled that I'm able to categorize information and write things that people go, wow, that was pretty interesting what you wrote. Well, I didn't really write it. I mean, I did. I'm the one who put it on a piece of paper, but I didn't think it through. It came through me.
Yeah, I'm excited to hear that, Gary. I really feel the same way, and I would kind of explain it probably in a little bit of different words and a little bit of different terms. But the way that you relayed that, I mean, I can absolutely relate to that. And I've been surprised about. I knew I was going to learn some things through this process, but the more frequently I write, and the longer that I do it, the longer that I've done it, I'm surprised about the extent of what I've learned. I mean, I'm an expert on Olympic style weightlifting, and I know that there's always new things to learn. I'm not arrogant in that way. I'm open to learning new things, but the extent of information that I've learned, little extra details and knowledge that I have because I'm digging in so very deeply in writing on Olympic style weightlifting. And absolutely, there are times where I'll go back and read over something that I wrote, and I don't even remember thinking about that. I don't even remember writing that down. I don't even know how or where that came from. So that's really cool to hear you say that as well. But when you're writing, Gary, what does that process look like for you? I know you talked about you kind of get out of the way and you research and you dig in and try to learn and write through that. But just as far as, you sitting down in routine, is it a daily thing that you do, or are there a certain number of hours per day that you try to hit? Is it just kind of by feel for you?
Well, I hope your audience can accept this answer because it is completely unmanaged.
Okay.
Today, I woke up at 1:15 a.m. after going to bed after 11 o'clock, and there was zero choice. I had to go and finish writing what I had started before I fell off because it came in the middle of the night. So I've basically been up all night. And today I haven't done anything since morning came and I was waiting for this call. I really haven't done anything because I absolutely was just trapped with my computer and the information that was flowing and the argument that I was creating for the topic that I'm bringing next. And it may not come again for 2 days. It might come again this afternoon.
Right.
So no, I don't have a plan. No, I don't force it. And my goal is always to make it clear enough that I understand it. If I understand it, I can explain it. If I can explain it, I will understand it. And when I say to you, for example, that when you ice damaged tissue, it literally traps the waste in and around the damaged site and prevents the natural flow of oxygen and supplies. That's not arbitrary. That's exactly like I say it every time. That took almost a year to get right. Almost a year. How many words is that? 20 words?
Right.
It took almost a year to get right. But once I understood the question, and what I say to people when they're talking to me for the first time is that Do you think it's a good idea to trap the waste in and around the damaged site and prevent the natural flow of oxygen and supplies? So far, of the many, many thousands of people I've asked that question to, not a single person has ever said yes. Well, that's
Mhm.
precisely what the Rice Protocol does. So that's what my writing is. My writing is getting it down so tight that I
Mhm.
can memorize it and then ask that question, give that information so that the people listening to me are kind of, well, yeah, I see what you're saying. I very rarely get in a debate. In fact, I won't get in a debate that I don't understand. Like I wouldn't even consider getting in a debate with you about weightlifting. I don't understand the process. I don't know anything about it. I've been to 2 weightlifting competitions in my life
Mhm.
that as a spectator, and it was when I was in my teens. So I would never debate you on that. But when I debate, it's going to be based on the information that I've gathered, categorized, organized, and practiced, and taken it to people who are experts, and then see how I do. And the simple question, I don't mean to push this question on you, but if you both answer this, just so I can add 2 more people to my list,
Mhm.
do either of you believe it's a good idea to trap the waste in and around the damaged site and prevent the natural flow of oxygen and supplies?
No,
Do we? It doesn't sound like a good idea, does it?
no, not at all.
Well, think about sitting still with a bag of ice secured to the damaged site while sticking that body part up in the air. There's nothing else could happen except you trap the waste in and around the damaged site and prevent the natural flow of oxygen and supplies. You can say, well, yeah, but no, it doesn't matter why you're doing it. That's what's happening. And then I'll have the people who will push back and they'll say, well, what about for pain control? And I say, well, let's just hold on a second. I have an answer for that. I liken that to the sympathetic bartender that gives the alcoholic a drink so he can temporarily feel better. Did you solve the problem? No. Did it help? Maybe. Did it make things worse? Probably. Now, why would anybody look at it and say, well, you can put ice on and make it numb? Yeah, you can temporarily relieve the pain. And if someone's an alcoholic, you can give them a drink and temporarily give them relief. But did you solve the problem? By making it cold, did you make the problem go away? Did you lessen the problem? Or worse, did you make the problem worse? Well, guess what? You made it worse because you delayed healing, you increased swelling, and you caused additional damage. And most importantly, you shut off the signals that alert you to harmful movement, and you need movement to solve the problem, and you need the signals to prevent you from doing harmful movement. You see what goes wrong? You see how simple it is to explain? And yet, the Rice Protocol is likely the most referenced, recommended protocol in Western medicine. And I say likely because someone said, well, what about? And I'm like, I don't know about putting peroxide on a cut. I guess that's a medical protocol, but the Rice Protocol is clearly one of the most recognized, recommended protocols in Western medicine. And it is completely wrong. It traps the waste in and around the damaged site and prevents the natural flow of oxygen supplies. Why would you want to do that? Now, from there, you continue and ask me questions, you challenge me, do whatever you want, because it is likely in my writing, I have already solved the question you're going to ask me. And every once in a while, someone throws a new question at me, and I welcome that. And if I don't know the answer, I'll say, I don't know. Give me a little bit to think about it or research it, and I'll answer you. But I'm often asked before I do a podcast, in fact, I think that Chad may have asked me, do you want to see questions in advance? And the answer is no. No, I don't need questions in advance. I know my topic, and I doubt that Chad needs
Mhm.
questions in advance, or that you need questions in advance, Dave, on weightlifting. If you were going to go on and talk about weightlifting, I doubt you need questions in advance. Well, I don't need questions in advance on my topic either.
Well, I have a quick question in terms of just taking it back a step and, just trying to reference kind of our listeners and who our audience really is. And I'd say most of them are fitness enthusiasts. And for them, they're not giving the recommendation of Rice as a protocol. They're probably using it. They're probably more of the user on the user end of this. And I think it would just be important for them to, one, get a better understanding of what rice is, and many of them might not even know what they're using and what the protocol is. And if you might go into the history a little bit of it being recommended and started, I believe it was in 78 by Gabe Merkin, if that's correct, and why it became such a standard over the course of the last 40 years or so, and what your thoughts are on what happened prior to that, why that became such a standard, but what was done prior to that 1978 kind of recommendation of rice being the go-to route for injury kind of healing process.
Well, I'd like to start at the end of that. Yes, Dr. Merkin did name it. In effect, invented it. He took it to the public in his 1978 sports medicine book. And I met with Dr. Merkin, and he has had very long conversations with me. I've been invited to his home. He did publicly recant after he read my book, said, look, I made this up in my 1978 sports medicine book. Research has clearly shown I was wrong. Don't do it. It delays healing, and gives a specific reference to the fact that it causes additional damage. Now, Dr. Merkin not only publicly recanted, he also wrote the foreword to the second edition of my book. So I got the doctor, the Harvard-trained MD, that invented the most recognized, referenced, and recommended protocol in Western medicine to publicly recant and write the foreword to the book that took down his protocol. Now, wow, that's like, okay, you tell me the last time someone told you something like that about something this big of a deal. Well, all I did was read the literature and interviewed several hundred people. It took about 7 years. Because at first, remember, my goal wasn't to prove it was wrong. My goal was to figure out the best way to do it. But then as you start looking and listening and reading, and you figure it out, and you say, wait a minute, where did this come from? Well, I traced it back to Everett Knowles, a 12-year-old from Somerville, Massachusetts. And I have this fully documented in my book with all of the best information that was available. And I interviewed Dr. Merkin on the topic. So what happened was Dr. Merkin simply viewed what was happening in the public, what people were doing since Everett Knowles' accident in 62, and in 78, he memorialized that protocol in his book and called it RICE, which is rest, ice, compression, and elevation. So now let's go back to Everett Knowles. What happened there? Well, Everett Knowles was a 12-year-old, and he hopped the freight train in Somerville, Massachusetts. When he hopped the train in celebration, he put his arm up and gave a cheer, and with that, hit a stone abutment and ripped his arm right off. Tore his arm off. Not knowing his arm was off, it was in his jacket. He picked up his arm. He thought he broke his arm and made his way up the hill, which is remarkable to me that that could even happen, but that's what actually happened. And some guys at some kind of a factory, I forget what the factory name was, but a factory saw him and got over to him and got the police and got him over to Mass General. He got the Mass General, a young doctor there, the young resident by the name of Reinl made a decision that would change the history of medicine. And what he said was, hey, we have a perfectly healthy 12-year-old and a fully intact arm. Let's sew this back on. And you got to realize why that matters, because in 62, that hadn't been done yet. It had not reattached a limb before. And on top of that, remember, there's no text, there's no cell phones, there's no fax machines. You got to go get the team together and bring them back to the hospital to do this. So here it comes. Dr. Malk gives an order while they're looking for the people, while they're trying to recruit the people in to do this surgery. He said, look, while we're figuring this out, put that arm on ice. And the myth began. With that, you say, well, why would you put the arm on ice? Because it would rot if you didn't. It wasn't attached to the body anymore. Just like if you go to a fish market, all the fish are on ice. That's why they're on ice. If they weren't, they would rot. So Dr. Malk simply gave an order, said, put that arm on ice while we're figuring this out. So now they get the team together and they sew the arm back on. They attach everything. It took multiple surgeries over many months, maybe even going into years by the time he had all his surgeries, but it took many surgeries, many months. But it worked. And now the reporters are starting to ask those big questions. Hey, if this ever happens, what do we need to know? Because remember, before you threw the body part away, but now you have to know what to do because you got to get to the hospital so they can sew it back on. And it goes like this. The doctor or the spokesperson who answered the question, we don't have a record of who it is. I mean, I've looked through all the old newspaper articles. There's just no record of who actually said this. What they said was, whatever happens, remain calm, don't panic. It became rest. Keep the severed body part out of the heat. That became ice. Use a tourniquet to prevent a bleed out in the intact part. That became compression. And keep the intact part above the heart to limit blood loss. That became elevation. So the Rice protocol literally, utterly has nothing to do with managing damaged tissue. It has to do with preserving a severed body part and preventing a bleed out. Now, isn't that bizarre? Well, no, actually it's not, because the public heard, oh, you get hurt, put it on ice. And then something happened in about 64 or 65. I'm sorry I don't have the exact date, but the photograph is available, and I do have it in my book, and it's available on the internet. Sandy Koufax was a famous major league pitcher for the Dodgers, and had a really, really painful elbow. And he couldn't stand anymore, or wouldn't stand any more needles shot into his arm to make it numb. That's how they handled it back then. And he told his trainer, he figured out a different way to make this stop hurting, because I'm not shooting any more needles in my arm. And the trainer, Bill Beulah, was the assistant trainer at the time for the Dodgers. Later, he became the head trainer, but at that time, I believe he was the assistant trainer. Put his arm in a bucket of ice. And that picture today, if you Google Sandy Koufax, bucket of ice, it pops right up on the internet. And that was the picture that went around the world. Through the sports world, I mean, Sandy Koufax was a big star. The Dodgers were a famous thing back in the day. Baseball was a big deal. And that picture of Sandy Koufax arm in ice, along with the recommendation from Dr. Malt's group on what you do, don't panic, keep it cool, use a tourniquet, elevate it. That protocol then pushed from 62 out to 78 when Merkin memorialized it in this book. Now, recently, a writer by the name of Lindsay Berra, actually Yogi Berra's granddaughter, believe it or not, but she's a very accomplished sports writer. Lindsay Berra was interviewing Dr. Merkin, and when she asked him, where exactly did the Rice protocol come from? He said, well, rest, ice, compression. And she said, what about the E? He said, well, Rick didn't sound very catchy, so I added elevation. That's actually what Dr. Merkin told to Lindsay. And I went, wow, Rick didn't work. Rice is nice, Rick doesn't work. So that's how it all happened. And then the mess took off in the 80s. Remember, Merkin's book is 78. By the way, I grew up in the late 50s, 60s. That's when I played sports. Never once in my entire sports career did I ever hear a coach ever once, never, ever, not even visible, telling anybody to put ice on damaged tissue. Never heard of it. We were told to walk it off. Don't sit still, it'll tighten up. Keep moving it. Everybody knew that was what you did. You don't sit still, you keep moving it. Well, okay, you want to do the opposite of that? Sit still with a bag of ice tightly secured to the area. Now you'll really stop stuff from moving. So the 80s come, and with the 80s came a phenomenon known as soccer moms. Now, I'm not sure how old you two are, but you may have actually been part of the soccer mom craze, because you may have been the soccer players. And the 80s came, and someone invented a little thing you could snap, go like that. You kind of snapped it, and it became cold. And almost every soccer mom had one of them in her bag. So if you got a bump, a bruise, a boo-boo, whatever, they put an ice on it, an ice pack on it. Now, it wasn't really ice, but it was a cold pack. And it just exploded. Now, a funny thing happened about 95 or so. Sports medicine clinics were just becoming popular through the late 80s into the 90s. And at that time, outpatient physical therapy was beginning to blossom. Today, you have an outpatient physical therapy clinic almost on every other corner. Back then, they didn't exist yet, back in the late 70s, early 80s. Now it's the beginning of the 90s. We're about 95 or so. And prior to that, from about, I'm going to make up the date, from about 85 to 95, insurance companies would pay for therapists to put ice on patients, and it would be a modality, so you could bill for ice. Well, when the insurance companies, Medicare led the way, I believe, when the insurance companies stopped paying for ice therapy in clinics, suddenly it was no longer needed. Now, ice begins to die at that point, because once the therapists aren't doing it as part of their protocol in the rehab center, the standard protocol, remember, if you can't bill for it, we ain't doing it. So they stopped doing it. And now it became not necessary. So the RICE protocol starts to unwind at that point, and it starts falling apart because sports medicine is getting bigger and bigger. And resting is not something that most people are willing to do. And something like, for example, I'll say to your audience, how many have heard of ankle pumps? You sprain your ankle, you do ankle pumps. You kind of wiggle your ankle back and forth. Almost everybody's heard that who's an athletic person. And with that, you go, well, what's that? That's walking it off. That's a form of walking it off. So as sports medicine hits and people start lifting weights and trying to get strong in rehab, suddenly the rest part of the RICE protocol is dying. And hardly anybody's buying in the rest anymore. By the way, Dr. Merkin also recanted on the rest part of his protocol. So it wouldn't have mattered if he recanted there. That was already falling apart. So now you come up to ice, and ice is almost falling off the chart at that point. By the time I started pushing hard, which is about a little over 10 years ago, I started pushing hard on trying to find the best way to do ice. It was already starting to come undone. Like when I got to Apollo Ono's trainer, a guy by the name of John Schaefer, who was Apollo's trainer. If you go to Apollo's book, his last 2 chapters in No Regrets is about his trainer. And when I got to him and talked to him about icing, he already wasn't doing it, but he didn't really know why. When I explained to him why, he was like, I knew it was wrong. So I started meeting people who knew it was wrong and weren't doing it, but weren't telling their friends about not doing it, because that was almost like, you can't do that. You got to do the RICE protocol. Well, they'd already abandoned the R part, the rest. Now the ice is falling off the charts. And then I went after the ice in a very big way, writing a book called Ice, the Illusionary Treatment Option, where I simply, undeniably, I've never lost a debate. We stick to the facts. I do not lose a debate, because I just asked the upfront question. Do you think it's a good idea to trap the waste in and around the damaged site and prevent the natural flow of oxygen supplies? They say no, and I say, well, then don't put ice on. Though now with that, the compression part, which is that next part, I looked at compression and didn't really push back against it, because I thought it made sense. Compress it, until I thought about it. And then I said, so what is it you're actually trying to do here? See, oh boy, now comes the big aha. By the way, this is the one, Chad, that woke me up in the middle of the night several years ago. And when I got up, my fingers could barely push the keys quick enough to write it down. I had to run to a piece of paper and write it longhand, because it was coming out so fast. And all I said was this: what are you trying to do? Well, we're trying to make the tissue cold and stop circulation. Okay, that's not a very good plan, is it? But see, that's what they were trying to do with the RICE protocol. And I said, no, that's not what you're trying to do. You're trying to prevent further loss and regenerate that which has been destroyed. Now, does that sound reasonable to both of you? I just want to make sure you're with me.
Absolutely.
That your goal is not to make the tissue cold and stop circulation, right? Your goal is to prevent further loss and regenerate that which has been destroyed. So once you've got that goal, all you got to do is match anything you're thinking about doing to that. For example, if you were trying to prevent further loss and regenerate that which has been destroyed, and you had a badly sprained ankle, 3rd-degree ankle sprain, would you recommend doing box jumps with a 100-pound barbell on your shoulders? No, because that's not going to preserve, and it's going to make things worse. Now, I know that's ridiculous, but I want to make a ridiculous point there. So you don't do things that make things worse. So you say, okay, so what makes things worse? This is very important now. This is the 5 key points. What makes things worse? Well, congestion in and around the damaged site will literally suffocate and kill otherwise perfect healthy cells that were not involved in the initial trauma. You get what goes wrong? You've got all that swelling, all that congestion, that congestion will suffocate and kill otherwise perfectly healthy cells that were not involved in the initial trauma. So you got to get rid of that. How do you get the congestion out? Okay, so let's look and say what the protocol is. The protocol is to sit still with a bag of ice tightly secured to the area while sticking it up in the air. Now, if you know anything about how the waste evacuates, and to the audience, understand if you don't know this, don't feel bad, because most people who have been trained with licenses don't know this until I remind them. It can only leave via the passive lymphatic system. There's no other exit for the waste. It doesn't evaporate and abracadabra won't work. It's got to go back to the passive lymphatic system. So how does the passive lymphatic system work? Well, clearly not by sitting still and not moving and making it cold and compressing it. That would do the opposite. It's doing the exact wrong thing. So how does it move? By activating muscles in and around the damaged site. In effect, walking it off. That's how it evacuates. There's no other way. What that muscle activation does is it presses the muscles around the lymphatic vessels, and those passive vessels then in effect milks the cow backwards. If you can picture in your mind what happens. So the waste gets pushed up a chamber. There's little chambers that move it up. They're one-way valves, so it goes up a chamber. Now the empty chamber has negative pressure that pulls more fluid or waste out of the interstitial space, and so on. So you milk the cow backwards. So that's the biggest category of loss. You solve that by activating the muscles in and around the damaged site, by walking it off. Now, what's another way that you lose? What else causes additional loss? Well, disuse atrophy. Well, that one's pretty simple because disuse atrophy is caused by disuse. So if you use the muscles in and around the damaged site, they won't atrophy. That's why it's called disuse atrophy. So if you use them, the muscle produces and releases what's called PGC alpha 1 that blocks the disuse atrophy. Blocks or retards, because it may not get all of it, but significantly reduces the problem. So that's the next category of loss, the disuse atrophy. So we've got the suffocation and killing of otherwise perfectly healthy cells that were not involved in initial trauma. We've got disuse atrophy. What's another category of loss? Well, adhesions or faulty scarring, where you lose range of motion, functional range. If you've ever had the pleasure of being hurt and then didn't reorganize that repaired tissue down as you were recovering, and you had adhesions that had to be broken, oh boy, get ready, because it's like a crying party, because it hurts so much. It's crazy how much it hurts. In fact, some people have to be put under anesthesia to break the adhesions. So you wouldn't want to have faulty scarring or adhesions. And how do you, if that would be another form of loss, how do you solve that? Well, you got to reorganize the repair tissue. This goes back to a category that says, well, how does it all work? Well, there's 3 steps to healing: inflammation, repair, and remodel. So you've got to remodel the repaired tissue to avoid those faulty scarrings or those adhesions that limit your range of motion. So there are your 3 big categories of loss: suffocation and killing of otherwise perfectly healthy cells, disuse atrophy, and faulty scarring affecting functional range of motion. Okay, so just take care of them. Well, how do you do it? By activating the muscles in and around the damaged site, by walking it off. That's how, not by sitting still with a bag of ice tightly secure while you stick the body part up in the air. That's the exact wrong solution to the problem. And you say, well, so what about regeneration? What drives that? Well, regeneration clearly is after you decongest the area in and around the damaged site, or simultaneously. But you got to decongest the area in and around the damaged site, but that's to prevent further loss. But that also touches a little bit on regeneration, because when you decongest the area in and around the damaged site, you no longer have the obstacle that's inhibiting the regeneration. So what happens in regeneration? Well, the first thing you have to do is rebuild the related vascular network. So follow me on this. That bruising you see under your skin, that means vessels broke, blood vessels broke. You've got to rebuild that related vascular network, because every cell's got to have touch. Everybody's got to get fixed. So until you rebuild the related vascular network, healing is compromised, or regeneration is compromised. So, okay, so what causes the vascular network to regenerate? Well, walking it off. It just so happens that the same stress that prevents or retards disuse atrophy, the same stress that reorganizes the repair tissue, the same stress that decongests the area in and around the damaged site, that same stress simultaneously. Now we're on our fourth simultaneous. Simultaneously rebuilds the related vascular network. And then the last thing to do with rebuilding, remember our two goals are to prevent further loss and regenerate that which has been destroyed. The last thing is myostatin. And in your world, you're probably very familiar with myostatin. Most people don't really know myostatin. But if you're old enough, you remember Boy Hercules. So to your audience, if you want to see an easy catch to it, Google Boy Hercules myostatin. It'll pop right up. And you'll see this young 10-year-old with giant muscles. And what happens is he doesn't have myostatin, and myostatin inhibits or controls muscle regeneration. So you wouldn't want your muscles to get too big, and myostatin is the regulator. So what happens with myostatin levels when you're inactive? Well, they elevate. So why they elevate? Well, to inhibit muscle regeneration. Well, why would your immune system ever want to inhibit muscle regeneration? Well, think about it this. On one side, you're atrophying from disuse. Your immune system is way too smart, way too well built to simultaneously be rebuilding the muscle it's shrinking. So you see why the problem is? Your immune system is saying, well, we ain't using this to shrink it. That's the atrophy, the disuse atrophy. Simultaneously, your myostatin levels elevate. Why? Well, to inhibit muscle regeneration. You wouldn't want to be shrinking on one side and growing on the other. So guess what? This is amazing. I'm always amused at this part. Guess what lowers myostatin levels? This is incredible. The same muscle activation that decongest the area in and around the damaged site, that prevent or retards disuse atrophy, that reorganizes repair tissue, relieve the faulty scarring and adhesions. The same stress, the same muscle activation that does those three things also rebuilds the related vascular network, also lowers myostatin levels. So you've got this incredible formula where you go, okay, here's what I got to do. I want to prevent further loss. I want to regenerate that which has been destroyed. What do I got to do? Prevent further loss. Okay, three things. I want to decongest the area. I want to prevent or retard disuse atrophy. I want to remodel the repair tissue. Okay, set, ready to go. What do I want to do in the regeneration? Got to rebuild the related vascular network in and around the damaged site. Okay, good, ready to go. What else I have to do? Got to lower the myostatin levels because elevated myostatin levels will inhibit muscle regeneration. So you go, well, if all of that is so, and by the way, it's so accurate that college professors call me up and ask me to tell it to them. So I'm positive I'm not mistaken in anything I just said. And by the way, it's all in the textbook. So all you got to do is go and read it, and you'll see it's there. But here's the thing. When you contrast that active recovery, I call it ARETA, active recovery is the answer. ARETA compared to rice is doing precisely the opposite of what you're trying to do. ARETA, active recovery is the answer, is doing precisely the right thing. So you go, well, does everyone know this? I'll ask both of you. Now, I'm assuming you're both not just athletes, that you're both educated. I'm not pandering to you. I'm just making a point that I've heard enough of you talk that I'm assuming you both have degrees in this topic. Answer truthfully, because it's not a trick. Did I tell you anything you didn't already know?
Not necessarily. It's just again, being put a particular way that makes you say, wow, like what have we been doing?
Well, I have now asked that question to thousands of people with educations similar to yours, MDs, DOs, DCs, DPTs, ATCs, strength and conditioning coaches. Not a single person has ever said I told them something they didn't already know. See, that's the crazy part. I didn't make anything up. I say to the students when I speak to them in the university setting, you don't need to go, because I asked them if I told you anything that you didn't already know, and everybody says, no, I know this. I say, okay, let me ask you a question. Do you think you need to go check with your professor to see if what I told you is true? Well, my professor teaches the rice bar. Just wait. Do you need to go and ask anyone if what I just told you is true, or do you know it's true? They always say, I know it's true. Okay, you don't have to go check with anybody. You don't have to go look it up. You don't have to Google it. You know that your goal is to prevent further loss and regenerate that which has been destroyed. You know your goal is tissue preservation and regeneration. By the way, when I wrote those 2 words, or those 3 words, however many words it is, tissue preservation and regeneration, 3 words. When I wrote those the first time in a paper that I called Secondary Cellular Death is Actually Negligent Homicide. No, I'm sorry. That paper is called Procrastination, a Fundamental Flaw in Injury Management. When I wrote that paper, we Googled it and tried to find it. If anybody else ever put those words in a sentence before, I was the first person ever to do it according to the searches that we did. And we ran heavy searches. So I'm nearly certain I'm the first person ever to put those words in the same sentence. Tissue preservation and regeneration. That's what you're trying to do. Now, how could that be? Because the protocol was so faulty, you would not have thought of what I just said. Until you abandon the protocol, this is difficult to see. But as soon as you abandon it, it's simple to see. You know that that's right. You know you've got to decongest the area in and around the damaged site. You know you got to prevent and retard disc atrophy. You know you got to remodel the repaired tissue. You know for sure that you've got to rebuild the related vascular network in and around the damaged site. And you might not have known exactly, I don't mean you, I mean your audience, may not exactly knew that myostatin inhibited muscle regeneration. But educated, if you're out of school after 97, that's when myostatin was first discovered or described in the literature. After 97, you're aware of myostatin. And anybody old enough to remember Boy Hercules, and I really encourage everyone in the audience, because that's the only one that might throw you. Just Google Boy Hercules and myostatin. It'll pop right up for you. And then you look at it and you go, well, you wouldn't want elevated myostatin levels when you're trying to come back from an injury because you want the muscle to regenerate. Right, of course you wouldn't. Now here's the remarkable thing. The great creator, believe whatever you want, was so smart that when the human body was invented, one single action, one stress, muscle activation, solved all 5 things simultaneously. That same muscle activation that decongests the area, that reorganizes repair tissue, that prevents or retards disc atrophy, that rebuilds the related vascular network, that lowers the myostatin levels, all done simultaneously by the exact same stress. What was the stress? Walking it off. Why was it done that way? What is the only thing you could count on humans doing before there were food stores and cars and all that stuff? Moving. Anything you count on. And so you're saying, well, so would everything be fixed by that? Musculoskeletal trauma, yes. You have musculoskeletal trauma, activating the muscles in and around the damaged site is how you accomplish those 5 tasks.
So Gary, this is fascinating, and I have a million questions, but there's a couple things I just want to kind of bring up before we kind of move forward. One, it seems like RICE became effective as a protocol more because of a good marketing strategy and a good branding strategy than any effective science behind it. That's basically it, right? It was something easy for people to memorize, easy for people to remember, and that's why it became the universal use tool. It was a good marketing strategy. Is that fairly?
It was a great name. Rice is nice. I remember when I first learned it. I was so happy with myself. I was so excited. Rest, ice, compression, elevation. I got it.
Right.
I mean, I remember being excited. I got it.
It just is a quick, easy thing for people to remember. Hey, if you get injured, do these 4 things. Easy for people to kind of actually implement rather than it being based on anything that actually has to do with science. So that part of it needs to be addressed. Like, okay, what you've been doing. Now, I find it interesting that you said, okay, I'm going to try to find the perfect protocol to actually use ICE effectively. What is that? And it led you down this path. Now, the path led you back to this active recovery, using that muscle group, walking it off. Now, have you been able to actually find a structured protocol for that, for using active recovery? Do you have a protocol that actually can be universally used? Or is it dependent on the injury, dependent on the muscle group, depending on, if it's a muscular issue or a skeletal issue? Have you been able to create a protocol around this active recovery method?
Yes. And to give a reference, my website is GaryReinl.com. Okay. If you go there, all of my articles are for free. Print them, use them, hand them out, whatever you want to do. Send the links to people. You or anybody else is welcome to go there. And then I have all the references to all the things that I write. And then my co-author, my lead co-author is very often, usually, the editor-in-chief of the Physician Sports Medicine Journal. Now, why do I say that? Because you could be tempted to think I sound radical. And I'm not actually. I'm ultra-conservative in my approach. I'm saying, here's what the literature says. Did you guys read this? So there's a great paper written by Buckwater in 99 in the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons. In their journal, he writes a book, an article called Loading. And he says that one of the most important discoveries of the centuries, is written in 1999, of the century was the understanding that loading damaged tissue facilitates the healings of muscles, ligaments, bones, tendons. Now, that is so profound. 99, you had to write that down? All my coaches in 1960 already knew that. Mm-hmm. It was one of the most important discoveries of the century. So you read that paper and you go, wow. And on my website, I have it fully explained in a paper called Healed, okay? So if you go up and pull my paper Healed, I explain Buckwater's paper, with quoting him. Or you can Google Buckwater's paper and figure it out on your own. Whatever you like. I explain it because the vast majority of my audience really doesn't want to read Buckwater's paper. But I quote and reference Buckwater's paper throughout my entire paper. So 3/4 of my paper is quotes from Buckwater's paper. So what's the protocol? It's very simple. Use your brain, never cause pain. That's it. You do active recovery and use your brain, never cause pain. In my book, I have protocols described for all kinds of things, from a broken jaw to turf toe. And what you do is this. If, say your ankle's hurt and it's badly swollen, and you say, well, I can't walk on my ankle. Okay, fine. Can you wiggle your toes? Well, yeah. Okay, wiggle your toes. Can you flex your quads while you're wiggling your toes? Yeah, that feels good. Okay, how about your calf? It kind of hurts if I flex my calf. Okay, don't do that. Wiggle your toes and flex your quads. Why would I do that? The lymphatic system is passive. There's some 165,000 miles of lymphatic vessels in your body, okay? And that's an incredible number if you think about the distance. It's like they're everywhere is what the point is. So when you activate the muscles in and around the damaged site, that milks the cow backwards. So anything is going to help. If you want to think of the worst thing you could do, sit still with a bag of ice wrapped tightly around you.
Yeah,
and so that's it.
Gary, I just want to confirm a few things for the audience here. And again, over our last couple of conversations, I've learned so much from you. And one of the things that you just said is, tell me if I get this wrong, use your brain, cause no pain, or was it reversed? I can't remember, but use your brain, cause no pain. And so one of the things that I think we all as athletes feel like we have to do something that causes pain for recovery and healing to take place. And some of that is because of the RICE protocol. You know, you compress or you ice, like you said before, ice is painful, especially through the first couple of minutes. But, you know, what you're saying, no pain, what you're doing for recovery to heal damaged tissue or just to recover in general, there should be no pain there. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that's what you're saying. So one of the things that we talked about last time too, along those terms, is that smashing. So if you're rolling out your quads or your hamstrings or something, that's painful. We're not saying that that's not beneficial, but that's also not recovery. That's not, you know, regenerating and helping you heal. That's more of a mobilization. Is that correct?
Correct. Now, so yes, my rule is this: use your brain, never cause pain. But the bigger point is this: athletes are trained to suffer today for a greater benefit tomorrow.
Yeah.
So we all know that. My birthday was on Sunday, and on my birthday, I always run 20 miles. So I run 10 miles up the hill and 10 miles down the hill. And I live in the desert. This is not nice. It's hot. And I'm in my late 60s. So doing such a thing is very painful. And in fact, one of my neighbors said to me, isn't that like painful? And I said, okay, yes. And they said, well, why do you do that? And I said to them, listen to me. It is impossible for me to answer that question for you because you asked it. There is no way
Right.
I can
Right.
explain to you why I would do something that I cannot explain to you. If you ask, I can't explain it. So it works like this. You've got this process that you're used to suffering for a gain, okay?
Mm-hmm.
That's called training. Recovery is not painful. Recovery is comfortable. It feels good. If your recovery is causing you pain, well, then you're pushing the game in a way you don't need to. It's a recovery technique. It's not a training technique. You got to separate the two of them. And if what you're doing is not recovery, it's training. So like the rowers, for example. People say to me, well, why wouldn't rowers be recovery? The rowers are in the recovery room at my gym. And I go, because they're in the wrong room. What do you want me to tell you?
Yeah.
How could something designed to break an adhesion, to cause tissue to release, cause harm? How could that possibly be part of recovery? And then some people use Hawk grips. There's a couple other brands, but Hawk grips is a very interesting self-tissue mobilization tool that it kind of looks like a knife, and you go up and down. Well, it looks more like a blunt knife, and you go up and down your muscles and release the tissue. Well, they actually warn you, hey, this could cause bruising. Well, then how in the world could you think that's recovery? It's not recovery. It's part of training. And once you separate and say, this is either recovery or it's training. So what would be recovery? Well, probably sleeping. That'd be recovery. How about a recovery drink? It doesn't seem like it's causing any harm. So yeah, that's probably recovery. How about the recovery bar? Yeah, probably. That's probably recovery. Anything that's causing pain, anything that's making you tired and sore, that has to be training. I don't care how slight it is. I didn't say that you're going to, improve your squat by rolling on the rower. It's not like it's hard, but it's definitely not recovery. So it's use your brain, never cause pain.
Yeah. So then we'd have to put in that category things like deep tissue massage as well. We'd have to consider that training or some sort of mobilization. And sorry, I just lost my thought there. But yeah, it just made me think of a deep tissue massage, because most people will go get a deep tissue massage for recovery. That's obviously painful. But also, I was wondering along those lines, the pants that you can put on that they blow up and they smash your legs, for example, they are doing that in sort of a milking fashion. So would you say that that is something that is recovery, or is that also training?
It's recovery, but I'm going to say something a little negative. And I normally don't comment on products, but because of the way you asked it, I'm going to. So what happens is this. If I have a swimming pool outside my door here, okay, and I could go to my swimming pool with a shot glass, a 1 ounce glass, and I could empty my swimming pool, and it would work. I could do it. It would empty. Ultimately, I could empty my swimming pool with a 1 ounce shot glass, right? You could do it, but it wouldn't be a very efficient way of doing it. So now let's look at those pants, okay, and say, well, what are they doing? And by the way, they have them for your shoulders and everything. And if you gave me one, I would take it and I would use it because it feels good, not because it's a very efficient recovery tool. Here's what goes wrong. Let's just say that there's two main brands. Let's not say their names, okay? You can if you want, but I don't want to say their names. I'm saying the products are good and I would use them if I had them, okay? So I'm not against them. I just recognize they're not very efficient at recovery. But if you get done using it and you say, wow, that felt great, that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing. So watch what happens. You say you're going to move waste through your passive lymphatic system by squeezing the skin, right? That's the goal. Is that how the lymphatic system works? Can you squeeze the skin and push waste through your passive lymphatic system? Well, that's not actually how it works. But let's say it did work. You have superficial vessels, intermediate vessels, and deep vessels, and everything in between. The larger, thicker, deeper vessels are deeper, okay? So let's say you pick the pressure. One company says they have the proper sequencing and pressure. Another company says they have the proper sequencing and pressure. The two top companies. Which one's right? Maybe they're both wrong. I don't know. Let's talk for a second and figure this out. So I'm going to put something on. It's going to press my legs, right? I have superficial, intermediate, and deep, and everything in between vessels. So 165,000 miles of vessels in your body, of lymphatic vessels. And I'm now going to squeeze my skin and try to move that waste through those passive vessels, okay? So let's say I pick a pressure that's optimal for my superficial vessel. So you see my hand, I'm squeezing it. That's optimal for my superficial vessel. What impact will that have on the larger, deeper, thicker vessels? I'll answer for you, none. If I picked a pressure that was optimal for the larger, thicker, deeper vessels, besides breaking the vessels on the surface of the skin, the superficial vessels could not handle that much pressure. Why would anyone think that would work? Now, does it work at all? Like I said, you can empty a swimming pool with a shot glass. So does it work? It does work. Is what they're saying true? It's true. And I wouldn't be misleading you if I said I can empty my swimming pool with a shot glass. That's telling the truth. So you got to watch sometimes the things that aren't exactly clear with the claim. And you say, well, if you said to them, well, could you put enough pressure on to push waste through your larger, thicker, deeper vessels without damaging the superficial vessels? Well, the answer is no. You couldn't. And they don't claim to, by the way. So does it work? It feels good. I can tell you that almost every customer that I have, almost every client that I work with, I have over 100 pro teams that I work with and over 500 collegiate teams altogether, and then a very significant touch to the military. And I don't know anybody of all my customers that doesn't have at least a couple of them. Mm-hmm. And guys love them. Women love them. They feel great. Oh, I want to get in the chair and do it. Okay, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with feeling good? If I took over those companies, the very first thing I do is throw away all the literature, and I'd say I have the ultimate feel-good product. I say, you put your athletes in this after they work out, after they have a game, compete, and they're going to get up and they're going to say they feel good. What's wrong with that? So what I would do, if I were using their product, what I would do is I would use their product, and then I would follow it up with active recovery.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, I agree with you in sitting in those things. It is relaxing. I mean, even if you turn the pressure up high and it's squeezing you really hard, it's very relaxing. I've fallen asleep sitting there using those things before. So I definitely agree in that regard. Dave, did you have any questions on that specifically? Because I wanted to go back to something else. But
well, in all honesty, I love it. I mean, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
Maybe you're saying it. I really enjoy doing it. I have a system here at my house that I really enjoy and use. And maybe it is just a feel good type of system. But I mean, for me, if it's more in my head, then fantastic. And I agree that maybe it's just a marketing change that the companies need to do. But I can see your point, and I think that these are things that people need to hear. They need to hear that from an actual science background, what's happening when the squeezing is happening. Is there any actual benefit to that? Those deeper parts of the body that are actually facilitating the benefit? And the answer is no. But if they are making you feel better, there's a benefit there as well. If they're making you feel better, even if it's just a psychological thing, there's a benefit there. I did have one other question about a modality that we used to use a lot at the Olympic Training Center that I found to be maybe, again, just in my mind helpful, but contrast bath, jumping between a hot bath into a cold bath and going back and forth there. That was one of the big recommendations in terms of helping to flush any soreness through. I'm curious what your thoughts are on contrast bath type of benefits.
Well, if we go only to literature, you'll find mixed. Somebody says, well, I think it's beneficial, and someone else says, no, we've shown it's not. There is evidence that going in cold tubs after you train dampens muscular adaptation. So you wouldn't want to dampen muscular adaptation. However, if you tell me that you feel good doing that and you like it, it probably doesn't hurt anything. Just don't do it after you train. Like if you're going to train at 6 a.m., do that at 8 p.m. Don't dampen your muscular adaptation. That's not a good plan. Now, with that, the literature says that that actually doesn't work, that it doesn't cause vasodilation and constriction to any significant level that would move waste. And here's the reason. It's very simple. The passive lymphatic system doesn't work like that. That's not how it works. Does it cause vasodilation? Probably. There's probably some hit from the superficial vessels where there's some increased and tightening and relaxation. But on the backside of that, did it affect the passive lymphatic system, which is the only way the waste can move? The waste can't go back through the venous return. And anybody who questions that, that just means they were trained before the discovery several years ago. The Sterling principle has been revised. And we now know, because of the microscopes or whatever they're called, I don't know what the things are called, but now they can look, the micron scopes, they can actually see what works and doesn't work. And the lymphatic system, you're not moving waste by jumping in and out of cold water. If you tell me it feels good, I'm not against it. Just realize that if you're doing it right after you train, the literature says that you're going to dampen muscular adaptation. So I don't think that's a good plan, and I don't think you'd want to do that. When you come back to the hard part of it and say, well, why do they recommend it? See, there goes the problem. Because the psychological benefit of suffering, like when I ran up the hill just now, we got to the 10-mile mark, and my pacer was with me. My son's as an accomplished long-distance runner, and he basically slows down and takes me up the hill. When I got to the top of the hill, and I knew I was turning with 10 to go, and it's on my birthday, I was very, very happy. And honestly, I don't remember the next 5 miles, because we've actually talked about it afterwards. I don't remember 10 to 15, because we came back down the hill and I was so satisfied that I got to that I don't think anything I did that day to make myself tired and sore in the first 10 mattered, because I overcompensated by being so joyful that I knew I was going to make it now. Once I turned, I know it's over, because I can tell how I feel. I got 10 to go. This game's over. I know I win. So does it hurt anything to go in the hot and cold? It very well may dampen muscular adaptation. But people often say to me, well, but doesn't it increase the flow because it tightens and relaxes? Well, actually, no. And here's how I proved that. I took a garden hose, and I ran it from my house to a drum. And what I did was turned it on, and I ran it for 3 straight minutes and measured how much water there was. And then what I did was turned it on and then stood on the hose at I think I went 20 seconds. I'm not sure what I did, but 15 or 20 seconds. And then I stood on it for 15 or 20 seconds. And then I took my foot off, and then I let it run, and I stood on it, and I stopped it. And so I stopped it, started, stopped it, started, stopped it, started. Guess what? Less fluid was in the drum the time that I stood on it and didn't stand on it. So by constricting it, not as much went through. And when I took my foot off, normal flow went through. By the way, by going hot to cold, that's going to cause very little relaxation around the related vascular system. So you're not going to get the nitric oxide dependent vasodilation, that's when you're actually putting stress on the muscle, and that causes the muscles around the blood vessels to relax. You're not getting that by jumping in and out of the hot water. Yes, there's some relaxation. Yes, you're going to increase. But if you're slowing it down here and speeding it up there, and it's just your blood, by the way, it's not going to affect your lymph flow because it's passive. Did you really get more at the end because you jump back and forth? Well, in my experiment, no. And I bet if anybody else does the experiment, you'll see the same thing. And what I would find very curious is that's been done for years. Like I remember that back in the 80s, people were talking about, I'm going to guess late 80s, maybe the first time I heard of it. If it really did that, don't you think someone would have done a study now where they actually measured it with ultrasound or something to say, hey, look, it actually increased the flow. But wait, we have another problem. It's blood flow. It's vascular. It's not lymphatic. The waste that you're feeling that makes you tired and sore, that waste goes back to your lymphatic system, not your venules. It's not going back to your venous return. So I hope I didn't give too long of an answer to.
Not at all.
But by the way, if you tell me you're happy doing it, I'm all for it. Just don't do it at the wrong time. Just like me running up the hill. Don't tell me I shouldn't do that because I'm in my late 60s and I'm going to screw up my knees because I don't believe you. And by the way, an odd thing to the world that often talks about knees getting damaged in your world from doing squats and things, which I don't believe. I don't believe that. I think if you do squats correctly, it doesn't hurt your knees at all. In fact, I think it strengthens them. But not knowing your field and knowing mine, or being a long distance runner, I've run well over 50,000 miles in my life. And I've run many, many hundreds. I don't think thousands, but hundreds of 20 or more mile runs. So I'm a very experienced long distance runner, not ultra long, but I'm a long distance runner. My doc wanted to take pictures of my knees. My co-author is an orthopedic surgeon, a knee surgeon. And he said, let me see your knees. So he took x-rays. He put them up on the screen. And he looked at me, he said, you know, people our age don't have knees that look like that. I had a beautiful, thick, white space all the way around my knees. Now, you would expect, with all the abuse I've done, that it wouldn't look like that. Unless you're reading the literature that's pro-stressing. Mm-hmm. You read the pro-stressing literature, you expect what my knees look like. Knees aren't trashed at all. Mm-hmm. You guys ever meet Dr. Squat?
I've never met him, no, but I've heard of him, yes.
Well, he died. He died a couple of years ago. But I was on a panel with him a couple of years ago, and at the Arnold, and he was just, I mean, I couldn't even, I was like a groupie, okay? I'm sitting next to Dr. Squat. Give me a break. Hearing his stories and how he trained all those years and all of the information and knowledge and stories that he had about squatting and how it wasn't dangerous and why it was a good thing to do. And basically, when I shrink down what all the things he told me in the couple hours I had to talk to him, he says, not the squatting, it's the bouncing out of the bottom and the sloppy squatting. I'm sorry, he said the sloppy squatting and the bouncing out of the bottom that hurts people. It's not squatting that hurts people. Squatting doesn't hurt you at all. And I thought, that makes sense. Makes sense. If you have sloppy squats and you go down and you bang real hard out of the bottom, that's probably not good for a lot of people's knees.
Chad, you put him up to saying this? This is Chad. Every time I speak with Chad, he is the first thing he brings up. So Chad's loving hearing this conversation.
Oh yeah,
right
no.
now.
I was gonna say, Gary, I'm even more of a fan. Just hearing you pro squat for sure. So I'm loving it.
I have a picture of me somewhere with Dr. Squat, and I've had the pleasure of meeting some pretty interesting, well-known people. And by the way, that same day I had my picture taken with Arnold Schwarzenegger, it's at the Arnold, so that's why he was there too. And if you said to me, which picture would you be willing to tear up? I'd tear up Arnold's. Are you kidding? I got Dr. Squat sitting next to me. Very good guy. Well, not unfortunately, he lived a good life. He was done.
Yeah. Awesome. And Dave, that's actually what I wanted to hear him talk about was the contrast and ice bath. And so just to kind of confirm, is sitting in an ice bath, and let's say sitting in an ice bath without contrast, it's probably not worth your time. But man, I agree with both of you guys. I think there is some sort of benefit, at least psychologically, to the feeling of accomplishment you get from sitting in an ice bath. I mean, it's painful. It's painful for the first 5 minutes. If you can make it through and sit there for longer, it's, so maybe if nothing else, Dave, that's what we benefited from. Dave and I, Gary, had this conversation not too long ago. It was pretty quick, Dave. I don't know if you even remember, but we were talking about sitting in ice baths and how, well, I think it helped me. I feel like it helped me. I did it. I sure did it a lot, but maybe it was just a matter of the pain relief that we got, and thinking that it was actually helping us recover. Gary, it's been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Yeah.
I'd like to just comment on that, because I'm not against things that people do that make them feel good, make them feel like they've improved their discipline. And there's nothing wrong with that stuff, but just know that why you're doing it. If you tell me you're doing it for discipline and for those kinds of things because it makes you feel good, okay, that's fine. I agree. But if you tell me you're doing it to facilitate recovery, I would ask you, how would that work? Because to regenerate the tissue, that'll have no impact on tissue regeneration. In fact, it may have the opposite. It may be negative on tissue regeneration. But once the tissue rewarms, the inflammatory response resumes, and your immune system takes over. So I doubt it has any long-term significant disadvantage, because the literature would have pointed that out by now. But it is in the literature very clear about it dampening muscular adaptation post-training. So that's there. Some studies say, well, the athlete said they felt better. That's subjective. You can't. I mean, I felt great when I ran 10 miles up the hill. I assure you, all of my neighbors would have felt terrible, and they would not have said they felt great.
Yeah. Yeah, that would have been me, Gary. I wouldn't have, I can't even make it to the first mile. So I would absolutely be feeling terrible. That would not make me feel better. But it's been a great conversation to have with you once again, Gary. I really appreciate you coming on to really get this message out to our listeners. I know they're going to benefit from this tremendously. I have benefited from it tremendously, and, sharing it with other people and making them more aware. Where can folks get your book, and how can they keep up with you?
The best place to go is GaryReinl.com. It's GaryReinl. If you Google the Anti-Iceman, that's my Twitter feed, that'll also bring you up to me. But on my website, the book's for sale there if you want to buy the book. A lot of people have read the book and have benefited from reading it. But I've also written a lot of articles, a dozen or more articles, where I explain things that maybe all you really want. You may not want to actually read the whole book. That's okay. I understand that. But if you want to lead others out of the ice age, you need to read the book, because I explain how to lead others out of the ice age in the book. And I give the whole history to it. So if you want to actually know what you're talking about, read the book. If you just want to know a detail, like the article called Procrastination, a Fundamental Flaw in Injury Management, that's a great piece to just tell you why you don't sit still with a bag of ice wrapped tightly around the area while sticking it up in the air. It fully explains it there about tissue preservation and regeneration. So I have articles that explain different things, protocol to follow. That's an article called Disuse, Wasting Away in Margaritaville. So if you read that stuff, well, if I'm not colorful, no one's going to read my stuff. So I mean, I'm competing with a million articles out there. But my co-author in almost all my key papers is the editor-in-chief of the Physician Sports Medicine Journal. Very normal, down the center of the road orthopedic surgeon who is also the medical director for the American Council on Exercise. So when I mean like conservative, he's like right down the center. And you say, well, why would he ever get involved with someone like me who's radical? I'm not radical. I'm all science. I'm saying, what does it say about the passive lymphatic system? How does it work? How would doing what you just said make that work? Oh, it doesn't. So do you agree that wouldn't work? Well, yeah. So why do you do it? Well, I'm not sure. The last thing on all of that I want to tell you, it's very important. People often say to me, well, I see what you're saying, that the RICE protocol doesn't sound like it works, but I've been doing it for 25 years. And Gary, it always worked. Oh, in spite of your intervention, it worked. In
Mm.
other words,
Right.
the human body is so well designed that even when you try to ruin the process, it still heals. Simple analogy.
Yeah.
Do we have another minute?
Sure.
Okay,
Yeah.
simple analogy. I call it the Skid Row protocol. Okay, not being disrespectful, just making a point. Skid Row protocol, guy falls off the curb. Okay, a Skid Row resident falls off the curb, rolls his ankle, sits in the ground for 3.5 minutes and curses at the curb and calls it names. Then stands up and hops down the street, finds a cigarette butt half smoked, lights it, smokes that, still limping, goes down a little bit, sits down, doesn't really make any effort whatsoever to solve the problem, just is angry, remains angry for the next 6 weeks, and ultimately the ankle heals. Can you think of anyone who would recommend the Skid Row protocol? I'm not being mean. I'm just telling you, this actually happens. He got better. How did his ankle get better following that protocol? He doesn't sleep well. He doesn't eat well. He didn't do anything rehabilitatively. And yet, ultimately, his ankle got better. So just because you get better doesn't mean it was a good protocol. The Rice protocol has worked for 25 years, not because it's a good protocol, but instead because the human body is so well designed. Even when you disrupt the process, it still ultimately heals.
Right. I love it. I love that analogy, and that's a good place to end it on for sure. So listeners out there, make sure that you keep moving, keep that ice off of you, and keep moving. That'll help you heal and recover. But also be sure to head over to powermonkeyfitness.com to keep up with the services and upcoming events. We are just about to start some new 4-week classes on gymnastics and weightlifting, so look out for that. Also, check out our Instagram pages for regular teaching and technical content at Power Monkey Fitness, at Dave Durante, and at Ollie Chad. On behalf of Power Monkey Fitness, we're your host. I'm Chad Vaughn with Dave Durante, and until next time, thank you all for listening.